I'm David Leighton Brown, the Master of Calumet College, and welcome, or welcome back, as the case may be, to the last speaker that we will have in this academic year. Those of you who are regular or irregular attenders at this series will know what the series is like, but for the rest of you, I want to give you a little bit of background and context. It's now about 5 years ago that the Faculty of Health undertook its first survey of students to find out what the undergraduate students in the faculty wanted and needed. And the absolute top priority expressed by students was that they wanted to get to know faculty members better. And in particular, they wanted to get to know what faculty members actually do when they're not teaching a class. And out of that survey and other expressions of interest from students came this imaginatively titled Faculty Research Profile Series, in which we ask a professor to do something different than professors do all the time. We give talks all the time, at conferences, as guest lecturers, as whatever it is, but always about a particular topic or a particular piece of research or on the theme that we are asked to speak about. What's different in this series is that I ask each professor, essentially in your own words, to respond to 3 questions. What are the questions or topics that have interested you so much that you have devoted your entire career to studying them? And how do you go about trying to find answers to those questions? Which is the other way of saying, what do you actually do day after day after day? And what are some of the most interesting findings that have reached you in the 10 or 20 or however many years you have been devoted to studying those particular subjects? Now, our speaker today is the second most long-lasting psychology faculty member who is a fellow of Calumet College. The most senior of all, Ron Schiess, was a fellow of the college from the creation of the college, I think, 40 years ago. But John Eastwood is the next longest serving fellow in the Department of Psychology. And as I was telling him before we began, I almost was ready to invite him to come and speak in this series a couple of years ago when I learned he was going on sabbatical. Good timing on your part, bad for me. But I didn't want to let this year expire without putting the arm on him, and thank goodness he was willing to respond. You know from the title, he's going to be talking about listening to boredom. I hope the rest of us will not be listening to boredom. And let me turn the microphone over to you.
Great,
thanks, Tom.
thank you. All right. Well, yeah, I'm really. We good? Yeah, I'm happy to be here and excited to kind of try giving out a different sort of talk, right? And so as suggested by Master Leighton Brown in this talk, I'm going to really step back from the details of my research and kind of reflect on lessons learned from listening to boredom. And I hope I'll address some of those questions that, that you indicated that you posed to the speaker sort of indirectly through my talk. You'll have to hunt a little bit to look for the answers to some of those questions about how I do my research and what's particularly passionate to me.
So,
yes?
As you're talking, is it okay to ask questions, or do you like kind of want questions in the end?
I'm open. Let's see how it unfolds.
Okay,
yeah.
in the microphone though.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Let's see how it unfolds. I've definitely planned a presentation and some time at the end for questions. But if you kind of, you've got something you want to interject and jump in, by all means, do so. So the topic for today is listening to boredom. And when I tell people that I study boredom, I get very strong reactions and very distinctive kinds of reactions that can actually be classified into, I think, maybe one of 4 categories. So the first kind of response is kind of an incredulous, what? Really? You study boredom? Like, is that legitimate? Like, what is there to study about boredom? Why would anyone study boredom? A little bit of an incredulous kind of response. A second response that I typically get is almost like this disdain for boredom or people who complain of being bored. I have no time for bored people. You know, there's so much to do in the world. I've got so many tasks on my to-do list. Don't talk to me about boredom. I don't want to hear about those folks, you know. And it's that almost contempt, and I find that kind of in itself a little bit curious. A third sort of response that I often get is, oh man, boredom sucks really bad, you know. I do everything I can to avoid it. You know, it's just such a painful experience for me. And so some people, you know, when they hear that, they really can kind of relate to the significance of the topic, perhaps. Another response that I get, and to some degree, I'll say it depends on the demographic. We'll talk a bit about this later. But wow, that's cool. Wow, interesting. Tell me more. Like, what do you mean you study boredom? I want to hear more about that. And I assume that when you heard about the topic for today, most of you probably fell into one of these 4 categories. Maybe we can actually, let's see, by a show of hands, how many of you were in this category when you heard about the topic? You thought, why would anyone study boredom? Anyone here in that? Okay, we got a couple, yeah? So again, like I said, it's interesting, you know, when I speak to people with different demographics, the frequency of people in these different categories shifts a little bit. Okay, what about this one? I have no time for bored people. Anyone want to admit that? Okay, yeah, so come on, what's wrong with these folks, right? Boredom is really painful and something that I just try to avoid at any cost. Anyone here who would kind of fall into that category? Okay, a few, not as many. And finally, how about this last category? Man, that's kind of cool. I want to hear more about that. Okay, yeah, that's good. All right, that's good. You get to be in 2 if you want. So, you know, I hope by the end of the talk today, if I can't shift you into this category 4 here, I hope at least to convince you that boredom is worth a second thought, that we should perhaps be a little more compassionate to those that complain of chronic boredom, and that we should perhaps all stop trying to avoid boredom. Okay, so let's start by getting bored. So imagine the following. You have to go to the Ministry of Transportation to renew your driver's license. You arrive early, hoping to avoid the crowds, and you step up to the clerk only to be told, sorry, you'll have to take a number and wait. So you shuffle over to the nearest chair and slump down, dreading the wait. And as time slowly passes, your body twists and fidgets restlessly. You cast about, looking here and there for relief. You prop your head up in your hands, and the lethargy kind of comes in waves, punctuated by moments of lethargy. You're drained of energy, but edgy. The urgency to act is intense. Time has slowed to a crawl. There's absolutely nothing to do, and you're bored. Then suddenly you realize that you have your stimulating distraction device in your bag. And you tremble with anticipation as you reach into your bag. You're about to be relieved. Your body relaxes, your mind clears, and soothing calm washes over you like a drug addict getting a fix. So, crisis averted? Perhaps. You know, you've drowned out a very unpleasant feeling, and that's a good thing. But what if boredom has a message for you? How should we respond to an instance of boredom? And what can we learn about ourselves from the fact that we experience boredom? And perhaps, you know, how could this knowledge help us live well? So I'll give you the punchline right now in case you get bored and nod off while I'm talking. Wake up. Listening to boredom can improve your life. So boredom, like all emotions, tell us how we are in the world. Fear tells us that we're in danger. Sadness tells us that we've lost something of value. So the question I want us to consider then is, what does boredom tell us? So to begin, we need to clarify what is boredom. And in a sense, I think our whole discussion is going to revolve around this question. And we'll continuously circle back to, the question of what is boredom. And I hope with each kind of revolution or each circle, we'll get a kind of a little bit of a deeper understanding of the phenomenon. So let me just start by saying that, boredom I think is hard to define. We all use the word boredom in our everyday life, and we're not tripped up. We know what we mean. I'm bored, or your friend tells you, oh, this is boring. We understand the words, but if we had to actually come up with a definition, it might be a bit of a challenge to do so. And in fact, people use the term boredom to refer to a wide range of experience, from very transient, trivial kind of dissatisfaction that passes once you get to the front of the line, to much more chronic, ongoing, protracted emotional difficulty. And so the term itself is used to refer to a wide range of phenomenon. Second thing I want to just say to begin with is that boredom is common. In fact, boredom is common across time, place, species, and age. One of my favorite quotes for illustrating the commonality of boredom across time and space is this graffiti here, this 2,000-year-old graffiti from a Roman wall. Wall, I wonder that you haven't fallen down in ruin when you've had to support all the boredom of your inscribers. So, we know that boredom has been around for a while. It's been with us for a while. It's common across cultures. One of the things that we're actually starting to look at in our lab, and I'm not going to get into this too much today, is cross-cultural questions about boredom. How does boredom manifest in different cultural contexts? How does boredom manifest, if at all, in rural Guatemala? What does that look like? How does that look different from a York University student? We could even say across species, right? I think, these animals look kind of happy. They don't look caged in. But, certainly animals in captivity exhibit behaviors that we might refer to as kind of boredom, or they might look bored. And in fact, animals in impoverished environments, in captivity, can end up behaving in very self-destructive ways. Pulling out feathers or fur, gnawing off limbs. And so, there seems to be something we might call boredom that seems to be common across species even. Okay, age. Age is something actually that hasn't been looked at too much. This is data from several thousand people in our lab that we've collected, and on the one axis here we have boredom proneness. So this refers to the tendency, the propensity to be bored based on a self-report questionnaire. And across the horizontal axis here we have different age categories. And so you can see kind of a clear linear trend here. I'm less confident in the data out at the 51 to 60-year-old range. We don't have as much data there. But you see a fairly clear trend suggesting there may be a reduction in boredom propensity over time. And so that's an interesting question to think about. And it's interesting, I was just looking the other day at some research on happiness. And some of that research suggests that happiness actually declines or hits a low point around 50 to 60. The sort of classic kind of midlife crisis kind of phenomenon. So general well-being and happiness is kind of bottoming out there just at a time when people are actually saying they're the least bored. So, I find that interesting, and at the very least it might suggest that we're not looking at something, boredom here is not just sort of a general dissatisfaction with life. It might be actually something a little more specific than that. The next thing I want to say is boredom is probably worse than you think. Boredom has been implicated in a wide range of psychological and social problems. So, the question we want to ask is, does it get a bad rap, or is it indeed a covert cause of so many plights? Perhaps it's not boredom itself, but the company it keeps that's the real source of the trouble for us. So getting the answer right to these and other questions about the consequences of boredom is critically important when we consider both the number and the range and the severity of the problems that have been blamed on boredom. So we can look at problem gambling, drug and alcohol addiction, anger, aggression, depression, anxiety, health problems, workplace errors, lost productivity have all been found to be associated with boredom. Boredom even has been associated with mortality and death. Here's a quote. I feel like I'm not alive in this moment in time, as if I'm a spectator to life and to myself. I feel detached from others around me. I feel a lack of sense of purpose and completeness. Most of all, I feel extremely bored. Bored of everything. Work, friends, hobbies, relationships, music, reading, movies. Bored all the time. No matter what the activity is, it leaves me feeling unfulfilled. I'm bored of thinking, of talking, of feeling, bored with being bored. So this is a quote from a case study of a man that committed suicide. And his treating clinicians went to great pains to point out that he didn't meet any diagnostic criteria for recognized mental health problems. He didn't meet the criteria for depression, and he wasn't depressed. But his chief complaint was boredom. We also know there's some epidemiologists in the UK did some poring through some old data, and they found that if there was a relationship between boredom proneness at time 1 and actually being dead at time 2 later on in life. So if you went into a room and asked people how prone they are to boredom and then checked in with them 30 years later, those that were reported being more prone to boredom earlier on had a greater likelihood of having passed away by the time that they connected with them again. So again, we got some associations here, right? These are correlations. We don't know for sure what they mean, but there's definitely some patterns here. So on the face of it, we can't afford to ignore boredom, I would argue. It's striking that academic psychologists have conducted so little research on the causes and consequences of boredom, given the significant problems that it's been associated with. So what do we know with some confidence might be caused by boredom? We don't know a lot yet, and let me just kind of highlight a few things that we do know. Performance decrements seem to be related to boredom. And this is a big deal if you're an airplane pilot or you're a nuclear power plant operator. I reviewed a study in the US a while back where they were looking at boredom amongst nuclear power plant operators. I thought, well, that's kind of interesting. Okay, maybe this better figure out what's going on here. Anger and aggression is something else that we seem to have some pretty good data seems to be perhaps causally related. Some work done in a lab in Ireland brought people into the lab and made them bored, and then noted that they behaved in more hostile, aggressive ways, particularly to members of an out-group. So this was in Ireland. So the Irish students were much more likely to espouse hostile attitudes and behave in aggressive ways towards English after being made bored. There's a lot of research associating anger and boredom. In fact, one quote attributed to Paul Tillich, a theologian, he talked about boredom being rage spread thin, which I thought was a great kind of description of that kind of underlying agitation, but kind of almost impetus. And some work in our lab, we've done a fair bit of work showing that the association between boredom and anger holds when you partial out and control for a whole host of other psychological variables that you think might be kind of masquerading as important third causal variables. Something that we know much less about, but there's some suggestive hints, is the relationship between boredom and depression. I'll mention briefly a little later about some of my qualitative interviews with chronically depressed people in hospital settings and talking to them about their experience of boredom. What we can say, what I think we can say quite confidently is from a psychometric point of view, i.e. from our ability to measure things, and from a conceptual or theoretical point of view, boredom and depression are distinct. There's reason to think that for some folks, being bored might be a risk factor for them to then developing depression down the road if they have the tendency towards depression. Being bored often is associated with an increased kind of ruminative, self-ruminative state that we know has been associated with depression. Some interesting kind of research, I forget where this was done, but they looked at people that were depressed, and boredom was one of the complaints that they were presenting with, and they were treated with medication for their depression, and the depression lifted, but not the boredom, suggesting that the impact of the medication was sort of selective to the depression and not boredom. So I'm pretty confident that they're distinct things. I think it's really too early to say kind of what, if any, causal relationship these two might have. Risk-taking, risky behavior, I think is something else we're pretty confident is related to boredom. We've done some research in our lab bringing people in, making them bored, and we can talk a little bit later about how we make people bored and what that's like. But particularly for men, bored men take risks and behave in risky ways, and even more so when they've experienced a loss or been slighted. So we've done some kind of gambling research where we have simulated slot machines, because one claim that's been made a lot is that people gamble out of boredom, or that boredom is a precursor or a cause to gambling. And so we wanted to actually experimentally try to test that or look at it. And it turns out that after a loss, bored men are much more risky in their betting behavior. And it's still early days in some of our work on this, but there's other researchers who have also shown an association between risk-taking behavior and boredom. So that's something that I think we have pretty good evidence for. The other thing that I want to say is that boredom is understudied. There's been very little research on boredom until, very little up until the 1970s, and then it picked up a little bit. And then in 2000, you started to see much more. I just did a quick PsycInfo search, so looking at the psychology database website before coming, and there was only 400 published papers on boredom. And that might seem like a lot, but it's not really when you think about the volume of papers on PsycInfo. So I think it's pretty safe to say that boredom is understudied. So how should we define boredom? Given that boredom is common and associated with numerous psychosocial problems and largely unstudied, I became very intrigued with the topic. And so I began listening to boredom by interviewing people who had been hospitalized for chronic, long-standing depression. And I wanted to hear what they had to say. Secondly, I interviewed people that did not struggle with mental health problems, but did complain of chronic boredom, and I wanted to hear from them. And thirdly, I read as broadly as I could about the topic, dipping into literary theory, anthropology, sociology, theology, philosophy. It turns out that observers of the human condition have been thinking about boredom for quite some time. It's just the psychologists that have sort of been lagging behind. In fact, there was so much disparate theory and ideas about boredom that it was really hard to make sense of it all. And it became clear that in order to have any hope of proceeding in a more scientific manner, we'd need to come up with a common, unified definition of boredom that could bring everyone together under the same tent, so to speak. So together with my students, we brought kind of hundreds of people into the lab, and we asked them how they think and feel and behave when they're bored. We wanted to know, in essence, what it's like to be bored. Secondly, in parallel with that, we exhaustively reviewed existing definitions of boredom in a wide variety of scholarly literatures and looked for the common areas of overlap amongst these different scholarly literatures. And then wanted to compare that with what the research participants were telling us in the lab. And to our delight, we found some remarkable convergence between what the research participants were telling us and the key areas of overlap that we found in the existing academic literature. So here in 6 words is the fruit of this one phase of our labor. Boredom is the unfulfilled desire for satisfying activity. So I call boredom, or refer to boredom, as the unengaged mind. The bored person feels as if there is nothing to do, as if they don't know what it is that they do want to do, or that they have to do things that they don't want to do. So doing, or lack of doing, is at the core of boredom. However, there are some additional experiential components that give boredom its unique emotional feel. The bored person feels that time is passing slowly, that they can't focus or concentrate, they can't focus their attention. And they feel both agitation and kind of high aroused negative affect, and also a listlessness or a low aroused negative affect. And so I've said that boredom is the unfulfilled desire for satisfying activity. And I just want to highlight quickly that that could be both mental or physical activity. Someone who's engaged in daydreaming, or lost in thought, or lost in a reverie, I would say is not bored. After an instance of daydreaming, they may say, oh, I was bored, and that's why my mind started to wander. But while they are absorbed in daydreaming, I would say by definition, they're not bored. By definition, boredom is the state of being unengaged. And so one of the things that we've started to do, I'm not going to get into this right now, but is mind wandering is something that's become very popular in some of the neuropsych literature, and trying to disentangle boredom from mind wandering is something that we're looking at and making distinctions there. Although the bored person typically laments an impoverished environment, that is, they attribute their boredom to an environment that's lacking in some way or boring, I would concur with another researcher, Conrad, who has emphasized the idea that boredom is between there and us. Let me try to unpack what I mean by this. Boredom is, in my view, essentially a breakdown in the relationship between the world and us. We want to connect, we want to realize our ability, we want to be effective, we want to engage, we want to matter and make a difference. Like the feeling of hunger reveals our need for food, I believe boredom reveals our need for dialogue and our need for connection. We might say that boredom tells us that we do best when our abilities, our ideas are realized. You can think of the extreme lack of connection in sensory deprivation or solitary confinement. Both forms of torture, they strikingly illustrate our need for connection or dialogue with something that is not us, whether that's an inanimate object or another person, another human being. So the next, critical question that you need to look at, or that we wanted to look at, is, so what's happening in your brain when you're bored? Like, what's going on? And given that attention is the cognitive process whereby we engage with the outer world and our inner thoughts, an instance of boredom, by definition, then, is going to be underpinned by a failure of attentional system. The exact nature of the attentional system involvement in boredom is an ongoing area of investigation by our research group, and the exact reasons why attention might be failing during an instance of boredom is an important question about more kind of distal causes of boredom. I think we can deepen our understanding of boredom by contrasting it with its opposite, and I would say in many ways flow is the opposite of boredom. How many of you are familiar with the concept of flow? A few of you are? Okay, yeah. So, flow is that mental state that's associated with being fully engaged, absorbed in activity to such a point that self-awareness recedes and all that's left is the doing. The person in a state of flow feels outside of time. Attention is singularly focused like a laser. There's a sense of vitality, joy, perhaps even ecstasy. And there's a strong sense of clarity and purpose and intrinsic motivation during a state of flow. So athletes talk about being in the zone, was something that would be an example of a flow state. So we have at one end of the spectrum what we might call mind in flow, and at the other end of the spectrum we have the unengaged mind. So what causes boredom? Well, the short answer is we don't know for sure, because researchers are only now beginning to systematically investigate the causes of boredom using scientific methodology. Most fundamentally, we could just say, well, boredom could be caused by something in the environment or something in the person or some interaction of the two. And environmental causes of boredom are perhaps the most intuitively obvious because, as I've said already, when we're bored, our default seems to be to blame the environment. In fact, many situations, I think, are inherently boring. However, what precisely makes a situation boring or not is I think, actually quite interesting the more you think about it. And something I'm not going to get into today, but something we've thought about. What I want to focus on today is the other side of the equation. What might be going on in me that could be contributing to an instance of boredom? And the answer appears to be that indeed there is something about us that could be contributing to the situation. And that we can't fully account for the causes of boredom without examining personality characteristics within people. In fact, researchers have even proposed and developed and examined something called boredom propensity or boredom proneness as a trait-like characteristic. And that's something that we've done a little bit of research on as well. So what I want to do right now is just look at, well, what are some of the characteristics of a boredom-prone individual? What are some of the characteristics? And the first thing I want to say is poor emotional awareness seems to be a potential risk factor for boredom. Our emotions, or as we'll see in a moment, lack of emotions, are thought to be one potential cause of boredom. Some people lack the ability to describe label and identify their emotions. In fact, psychologists have a term for this, it's referred to as alexithymia. So alexithymia refers to people who they can't kind of identify what's going on inside for them. So if you were to ask them, if you ask someone who has alexithymia, how do you feel? They might say, well, I have a stomach ache, right? So they might somaticize or describe their distress more in bodily terms. Just one second, I'll get you, it's okay. Or they might answer in very broad terms like, well, I feel bad, or, but they lack the ability to make more nuanced statements like I feel sad or discouraged or frustrated or something like that. And one of the things that we know is that alexithymia, that characteristic seems to be related to the tendency to be bored. Yeah?
Sorry, I just wanted to ask, when you talk about poor emotional awareness, are you talking about emotional intelligence? Like having poor emotional intelligence?
So emotional intelligence, I think, is emotional intelligence is not a concept I'm completely familiar with, but I understand that it to be a much broader concept that might refer to, the ability to interact with others in an adaptive manner. Here we're talking about a more micro component of emotional intelligence, I would say, and that micro component is the ability to look inward to one's interior life and identify and label what it is you're feeling.
So more of an introspective aspect of emotional intelligence, probably.
You could say that, I think, yeah. Yeah. And so you might think, well, what's the connection here? Why would this be connected to boredom? And I think here, if you think about feelings as compass points that help orient us to things that we find important, pleasurable or meaningful, we can quickly see how alexithymia could be a problem. Because without a rich, differentiated inner emotional life that we can easily comprehend and put into words for ourselves and others, we could easily lose our way as we sort of travel through life. What's important to me? How was I feeling when she said that? Our feelings provide us with important information we need to navigate successfully. So if we can't describe or label our feelings, we'll struggle to identify satisfying targets for engagement in the world. And in this case, we may actually turn to the world to try to help us figure out what it is that we desire. Sort of like trying on one suit of clothing after another until you find something that sort of feels right, One researcher has used the analogy of like when you forget a name and you try to remember it. Was it Don? Dave? What was that guy's name? No, Don, that's it. Yeah, that's it. It's kind of like, you go to the world to try out different things. Is this what I want? Is this going to satisfy? No, that's not right. Is this what I want? No, that's not quite right either. So it's sort of like, I like that analogy because it suggests we have an inarticulate sense of what we want, enough to tell us that we need to go out into the world to find something, but it's not articulate enough for us to kind of evaluate candidate options, right? So then we kind of restlessly try out options to see if they satisfy. Another thing that's been associated with boredom is trauma, and that might be kind of off the top a little surprising, and this is something that we've only very recently started to look at. But I think you'll see in a minute, this follows clearly from what I've said earlier about emotional awareness, because researchers have known for quite some time that part of the post-traumatic reaction can involve an emotional numbing or a flattening of feelings. It's as if after experiencing trauma, people sometimes become less emotionally alive or they shut down in an attempt to anesthetize themselves. And so if they've kind of emotionally shut down and they're more flat, then they're going to lack that awareness of their interior life and struggle to find satisfying targets for engagement in the world.
Just a quick question. Do you mean emotional trauma, physical trauma, or both?
Well, it's
concussion, which is certainly a form of trauma.
Right. First of all, let me just say this is really preliminary stuff. But what I was thinking of when I was speaking there was emotional trauma that could be a result from a fall, but I'm not talking about the physical trauma to the brain, although a colleague of mine in Waterloo is very interested in traumatic brain injury and boredom, because people who have experienced traumatic brain injury report more boredom. And that's a common sequelae or complaint. And then there's lots of interesting questions about why that might be. Is it because their opportunity for activity that they were familiar with is now impoverished? They can't do the things they could before? or, you know, one of the things that we're quite interested in is some kind of some subtle or diffuse impairment in the attention system, right? Another risk factor for boredom is limited life meaning. So a sense that life is meaningful and coherent, that we're living in line with our values and beliefs is really important for well-being. And this is something that, you know, we've looked at in our lab fairly extensively. So we know that people who report their life being less meaningful also report experiencing more boredom. We also know longitudinally that levels of life meaning at time 1 predict boredom levels later on in time. And we've also experimentally brought people into the lab and you know, made them feel like their life is less meaningful. So that might sound kind of, I don't know. What we do is we get them to identify some of their key values, some of their important values in life, and then get them to either reflect and write essays about times when they behaved in ways that were consistent with their values or in ways that were inconsistent with their values. And then we have a way of kind of debriefing them and kind of helping them feel settled again by the end of the experiment. But what we find is that that also seems to have an impact on boredom levels. I've kind of alluded to this attention capacity one already. You know, given that any instance of boredom appears to be underpinned by a failure of our attention system, it makes a lot of sense that kind of a more fundamental, long-standing problem with attention might be another key risk factor for boredom. And we know that people with ADHD, severe psychopathology, traumatic brain injury, we know people that also have some very clear impairments in their attentional system are also reporting higher levels of boredom. Still early days there, but you know, it seems to be that in particular executive functioning seems to be one of the key attentional components. So I'm using the word attention here quite loosely or broadly when I talk about poor attention capacity. Okay, so here's another one. High sensitivity to pain or pleasure seems to be a risk factor for boredom. So the joke goes that there are two kinds of people in the world, those who think there are two kinds of people in the world and those that know there are not. So I'll risk sounding simple-minded by saying, well, there is kind of two people in the world. Those that act to maximize pleasure and those that act to minimize pain. So for some people, the absence of pain is much more important than the presence of pleasure. And the converse is true for others, you know. So I have my little high pleasure-seeking skydiver here who has a high need for sensations and seeking pleasure, and then the little kind of anxious, worried fellow who's much more sensitive to the possibility of pain. So boredom is the state of wanting to be engaged and struggling to find satisfying activity. And we know that motivation is that source of energy and the drive to become engaged. So it would make sense that kind of extreme or disordered motivational systems could also be clearly related to boredom. You know, someone who has a very high need for sensation or highly sensitive to reward or pleasure will energetically kind of pursue activities in the world, have a high need for excitement. To them, the rest of us are moving too slowly and missing out on all the fun that comes from living on the edge. But given their high need for stimulation and excitement, they'll often find the world lacking and unable to satisfy that need. You know, and then on the opposite end, or the other side, we have someone who has a high sensitivity to punishment. They're going to be cautiously withdrawing from the world that might hurt them, and they have a high need for calmness and safety. And to them, the rest of us are, you know, moving too fast and missing all the pleasure or the relief that comes from being secure and being safe. So we could say simply that the environment better meets the needs of people kind of with more middling levels of motivational systems. So how should we respond to boredom? So when we hear, you know, when we're bored or we hear complaints of boredom, we often kind of respond in a couple of different ways. We might trivialize the feeling, or we might tell ourselves or others, you know, just kind of snap out of it, what's wrong with you? Don't be so self-indulgent, or there's no reason to be bored. On the other hand, we sometimes sort of really desperately attempt to eliminate the feeling, perhaps at great cost, you know. I just can't finish this report for work, I'm so bored, you know, I wonder what's on TV. So how then should we respond to boredom? And that's exactly the question I want to explore with you right now. And you know, to start, I want to emphasize that we're entering really uncharted territory here, because probably the least amount of boredom research has been done on coping with boredom or responding to boredom. So much of what I'm going to say here, you know, amounts to kind of informed speculation. There's two ways of thinking about this. We can first think about what we can do to prevent the occurrence of boredom. We could also think about, you know, what we can do when boredom strikes, you know, when we're in the throes of boredom. And that's what I want to start with. What can we do when boredom strikes? So the first thing I want to say is, you know, don't panic. Panicking is generally never a good strategy. We can't think clearly or make good decisions when gripped by panic. Furthermore, the urge to get rid of the aversive feeling is so strong that any immediate relief trumps sort of you know, a more careful consideration of the whole situation. Strategies that bring short-term relief, in fact, might actually make things worse in the long run. You know, because it's such an aversive feeling, we might look frantically for something entertaining to capture and hold our attention. And this might be at worst, it might actually contribute to us re-experiencing boredom with a vengeance once that entertainment kind of ends. So the metaphor I like to use to talk about this is, the metaphor that comes to mind for me is that of quicksand. You know, boredom is like quicksand. The more we thrash around, the more we're likely to get pulled under. And you need to override that natural inclination to thrash around and attempt to free yourself, because it's actually going to be counterproductive. So step two, I want to say, is get curious. So difficult though it is, moving towards this aversive feeling and inviting it in with curiosity is more helpful than running away. So thankfully, I've never been in quicksand myself, but I've been told that the thing to do is to stretch out and increase your surface area and float on the surface. You know, and that's the hardest thing to do in the world when you think like you're going to drown. And you're like, are you crazy? You're telling me I just got to kind of like stretch out and float here? And I'm saying, yes, exactly. That is what you ought to do. And I think, you know, that's a good general strategy for negative emotions often as well. Trying to avoid fear and pain often makes it worse, and pushing away negative feelings can make them stronger and increase the grip that they have on us. So accepting and curiously exploring negative feelings is not the same thing as wishing they would stick around or wallowing in them, but changing our relationship to those feelings from one of fear and avoidance to one of acceptance and mastery. The other thing I want to say is, you know, be bold. This is your chance to make a change and think big. Don't just say, well, I think that what needs to change is I need a magazine to read. You know, boredom withers in the face of bold, passionate ideas. It's kind of like kryptonite for boredom. But small ideas, weakly held, are, on the contrary, a perfect breeding ground for boredom. So boredom can be a goad to significant and lasting personal and societal change if we respond to it thoughtfully. If we can get our heads wrapped around it in that way, we might even see boredom as a bit of a gift to us. It's an aversive feeling that shakes us free from the status quo and points out the need for change. Reframe. So perhaps you thought, well, you know, be bold, this is a bit much. Come on, John. I mean, sometimes situations are just boring, you know, like, and yeah, they are. But in those situations, sometimes a little change can do the trick, right? Let's say you're struggling to try to study and you're having a hard time, the material's not coming in. If you can reframe this situation and remind yourself, why am I sitting here studying this economics textbook, right? I've always dreamed of that job in business, and, you know, the more I struggle right now, the more I can take that as evidence that I'm working towards a valued life goal. And so, you know, reframing the experience and linking it up with things that are more valuable to us can be a very important strategy. In fact, you know, one researcher, Nett, who's done probably the person who's done the most and the only work on coping with boredom, looks at it in high school math students. And, you know, he draws on general coping literature, which talks about you can have approach or avoidance strategies or cognitive behavioral kinds of strategies. So across the top here, we have the the approach, right? And along here we have the avoidance, and here's the cognitive, and here's the behavioral kinds of things. So you had a 2x2 kind of matrix. And so reframing is like a cognitive approach strategy. You move towards the situation, reframe what's happening, link it up with something of value to you. And perhaps not surprisingly, high school math students in NET's research cope the best with boredom and cope the best with the math material when they're able to engage in that kind of a coping strategy. So the other thing that we can sort of think about here is, okay, so we've talked a little bit about what to do when boredom strikes. What about preventing debilitating boredom, or how can we live in the light of boredom or the fact that boredom occurs? And I want to suggest to you an idea here of how you can prevent boredom. And my idea is to wash the dishes with reverence. And so what I mean by reverence is sort of like a deep respect. And I'm going to suggest to you that embracing routine and the mundane with care and commitment is a good strategy for avoiding boredom. And on the face of it, this might seem like completely vacuous advice, right? To not be bored, you just have to not be bored with things that are boring. That's like saying, I have the secret to becoming rich. You buy stocks when they're low and you sell them when you're high, right? It's simple. I hope to kind of try to explain to you here why I think, in fact, there is something useful in this recommendation to celebrate the everyday as a way to live in the light of boredom, or a way to prevent this debilitating chronic boredom. And I believe that washing the dishes with reverence has several distinct active ingredients that help stave off debilitating boredom. So mundane activity is like the superfood of mental health, and I want to try to look at each of the components of this sort of superfood. So the first thing I want to say is that, you're ordinary, and boredom is sometimes born out of this arrogant belief that we can somehow stand outside of time and rise above the ordinary. In fact, most of us are wonderfully ordinary. That's it. We're ordinary, and life does not demand anything more of us. And the sooner we accept that we're ordinary, the happier and healthier we'll be, right? So I've said it, and we can all forget the hype. Despite what your mother told you, you're not special. And this fact should not be demoralizing, but rather, I believe, very liberating. I'm not saying that you shouldn't aspire to greatness. I'm just suggesting that you change your attitude towards taking out the garbage. And stop buying the hype that you can and should have an extraordinary life. Because you don't really want an extraordinary life anyway. What you want is to be happy and to be well. And extraordinariness is not likely to bring you either, or won't necessarily bring you either. Performing mundane acts reminds us that we're lodged in time and space. We can't rise above the facts of what it means to be human. We need to sleep, eat, care for our bodies, and these tasks are never finished. We have to repeat them daily. And this is not a problem to rail against, but a reality to embrace. And I think we ignore those existential facts at our peril. So the other thing here is, wash the dishes with reverence. Life is ordinary. Most of life is ordinary. It couldn't really be any other way. By definition, most of our time is spent doing ordinary things. That's what ordinary means. Unfortunately, wishing it were not true does not change this fact, and picking a fight with reality is a losing prospect. Actually, you won't just fail to make life extraordinary, you'll make yourself miserable and bored. So I think washing the dishes is a literal and symbolic affirmation of the fact that life is ordinary. Mundane acts performed repeatedly cultivate our capacity to make peace with the ordinariness of life and to find satisfaction in the commonplace. And again, this shouldn't be taken as a nihilistic worldview. On the contrary, I believe it's one of the most life-affirming truths to come to terms with. There's that research I'll just mention quickly about the hedonic treadmill or hedonic thermostat. Have you guys heard about this concept? So the idea is if someone experiences some great windfall, they win the lottery or something great happens to them, and their sense of happiness and joy increases for a while, and then it kind of comes back to the baseline where it was before they won the lottery. So we seem to have this kind of, we can be shifted around a little bit by certain factors, but there's this kind of happiness that's associated with our ordinary set point in life. So some of our research on boredom got picked up in the media a lot the last little while, and so I spent a lot of time talking to the media, and that's something maybe we could talk a little bit about if people want. That's a disorienting kind of experience. Well, one magazine writer contacted me, and they were doing a piece about how to avoid falling into a rut and how to avoid boredom, and would I consider writing something for them or interview with them. And it turns out this was, the magazine was, the title of the magazine is More, for Women of Substance and Style, right? And they wanted to do this piece about how to avoid boredom. So if I had more time and chutzpah, I would have kind of wrote this subversive piece about how, well, stop reading these kinds of magazines, and that's how you can avoid boredom. The other idea here about the other component of washing the dishes, this superfood that staves off boredom, is commitment brings meaning. So we've already talked about the association between lack of meaning and boredom. But if you think about brushing our teeth and making our bed every day, even though we'll have to do it all over again tomorrow, fosters our capacity for commitment. And commitment is an important foundation for meaning. An activity can become meaningful precisely because we've committed ourselves to it. To be sure, I believe it also works the other way, that we commit ourselves to things we find meaningful. But right now I want to focus on that kind of other direction of causality, commitment preceding meaning. And I think our society seems to encourage us to relinquish commitment and responsibility in order to achieve self-actualization and happiness. The idea is to throw off constraints, to follow our hearts to bliss. And I'm not convinced it actually works that way. Sure, oppressive constraints are a problem, but so too is the inability to make and follow through on commitments. And I think as a society as a whole, we're insufficiently sensitized to the cost associated with not being able to make a commitment. So refusing to commit to any activity or kind of reality or life is the same thing as saying, I don't care. Lack of commitment is sort of like a disaffection or lack of care for what is. So finally, if we just come back to brushing our teeth for a moment, I believe that commitment is a skill that we can develop. It's not just something that magically happens to us or does not happen. And I think it's in our power to develop this capacity to commit. And I think there's no better place to develop this capacity than in mundane activities. Because by committing to the commonplace activities of life, we make life meaningful. If we hold back from or skip out on the commonplace, then we make life less meaningful. Another point I want to make about washing the dishes is this concept of presence. Wash the dishes with reverence here is better than somewhere else. So washing the dishes forces us to slow down and invites us to be mindfully present in the moment. Most of our life is lived on the cusp of the next moment rather than in the present one. Where the present might just be a jumping off point for some future end rather than the present being an end in itself. And so we're constantly in transition. And there's something about washing the dishes. The thing about washing dishes is it doesn't really get you anywhere. It's pretty much useless. You have to clean the dishes all over again the next time. I mean, sure, when you go to the cupboard, you have some clean dishes, and that's a good thing. But it's not a particularly glorious future to anticipate. So this makes washing the dishes and all other mundane acts a perfect vehicle for practicing being mindful, because mundane acts don't point you to some future state. They have no inherent distractions in them away to some future state. So to be sure, it's hard to be present doing mindless, mundane tasks like washing the dishes, but that's not because of the dishes, it's because of us. There's nothing about the dishes that points us to some future state. I just recently read a really cool study on presence. So you guys are familiar with the idea of being present in the moment. So they did this study where they looked at, they found a correlation between telomere length, which is thought to be an indicator of physical health and well-being, and the capacity to be present. So there's kind of a striking correlation across very different kinds of methods, right? On the one hand, you've got a self-report and various other measures of presence, and on the other hand, you've got this biological measure of well-being and telomere length. So the value of developing the capacity to be mindfully present is, I think, pretty clear when we start to look at some of this emerging evidence. And I think you can see that boredom is kind of like the antithesis of presence. Boredom is precisely the state of rejecting and being dissatisfied with the present. Boredom is wanting to be experienced something else. And boredom, I find this interesting, that boredom is kind of like infused with a disdain for itself. It's kind of like a very strange emotional experience in that sense. So when we're bored, the lack of presence is really laid completely bare. Boredom is kind of like pure lack of presence because there's no alternative place or time in which we're residing at the moment of being bored. Another point I want to make here about washing the dishes with reverence is you can only do one thing at a time. So, cognitive scientists have made a lot of gains in understanding how our brain works and how we think and take in information. And one idea I want to just talk to you about is this, the idea that our conscious mind can really only do one thing at a time. We can't really multitask. We might be able to rapidly switch back and forth between different tasks, but if a task requires our conscious awareness, then we can't do it and something else at the same time. Some activities like walking, are highly rehearsed and perhaps can be done automatically without conscious awareness. So it's kind of likely true that you can walk and chew gum at the same time. But, if you're walking and you kind of hit a patch of ice or something, you're going to probably stop chewing your gum and kind of pay attention to the situation in front of you. So let me give you kind of another example of this. That maybe, you can't talk to your flesh and blood friend sitting in front of you in the moment and text your virtual friend who's somewhere else at the same time. Sorry, you might think you can, but you're wrong. You can't do both of these things simultaneously. You can rapidly switch back and forth between focusing on your real friend and your virtual friend. But there's going to be a certain cost that comes with that. One piece of research that I wanted to tell you about that I didn't share yet, so let me just mention it now, and then we'll come back to these two friends. So imagine you've got kind of 3 doors in front of you here. Door number 1, door number 2, and door number 3. You walk into door number 1, and you come in, and you're given a text to read. And you're told you have to read this, and when you're done, we're going to ask you some questions about the text and about your experience of reading it. Okay, fine. So you go into room 1, it's kind of quiet, there's a comfortable chair there, you sit down, you read it, and then you come out and answer questions about it. Door number 2, you go in there, exactly the same text is sitting on the table waiting for you, but there's this loud, blaring music being pumped into the room while you're sitting there. And it's kind of distracting and annoying, you can't pay attention to what you're reading. And you come out, and it was hard for you to answer the questions because you weren't able to focus your attention. The third room, same text again, sitting there waiting for you, but this time there's actually some subliminal or very subtle noise that's being pumped into the room. It's barely loud enough to even detect. You can't even consciously notice it's there. And yet it's enough to impact your ability to attend and focus. And then one of the things that the researchers did is they asked people about how boring the task was or how boring the reading was they had to do. So what did they find? So in the condition where there was really loud noise that interfered with their ability to focus, they said, man, that was a really annoying task. I couldn't concentrate. They couldn't answer the content questions. But they didn't find the situation boring, and they didn't find the task boring. It was in that room with the subliminal noise that they said, this was the most boring thing I've ever had to read. I could barely focus my attention on it. I couldn't pay attention to the material. Why did you ask me to read this? So the idea here is that they were distracted and unable to engage with the material, but they couldn't attribute that difficulty engaging to noise because it was too quiet and subliminal. They couldn't attribute it to the noise the same way the folks in the loud room could. Right? So let's go back to our 2 friends again, right? Oh, let me tell you one other piece of research. Okay, so research showing that if you actively ignore something, even something as trivial as just a shape, if you're showing objects on a computer screen and I have to ignore a shape over here to pay attention to something over here, and then later on you ask me what I think about that shape, I dislike the shape that I've had to ignore. So things that you actively ignore, you later on devalue and you have less preference for. So, okay, so now we'll go back to our two friends, right? So what's actually happening here? You're not simultaneously attending to both friends. You're switching back and forth. While you're talking to friend one, friend two is a distraction you're having to ignore. Uh-oh, what happens to things we ignore? Then you switch back to your other friend and ignore your other friend over here. And we know that if you're distracted and going back and forth, you're not going to be able to fully engage. And so I kind of got off here on a little bit. But what I wanted to just say is that, we can't really do multiple things at the same time. And washing the dishes with reverence, I think, cultivates our capacity to singularly focus our attention on something that's not inherently interesting. So can we, respond to boredom in a manner that perhaps, turns it into a positive situation? I don't want to say too much about this, but I want to say that, indeed, boredom can be the impetus to creativity, innovation, and meaning making. Some researchers showed that when you make people bored, they actively try to go out and generate meaning for themselves. They actively search for meaning. They might engage in a nostalgia. They might engage in kind of pro-social action, or they might engage in kind of out-group attacking. But these are all seen as attempts to try to regain equilibrium or regain a sense of meaning. And so I think, as I've said earlier, the boredom can be a real kind of goad or an impetus to creativity and innovation. So what would it mean to curiously explore our boredom? I think boredom is a signal that something needs to change. So we could start by asking ourselves, why am I bored right now? What within me perhaps needs to change? So, when boredom strikes, it's kind of, your call. What are you going to do? Numb yourself with a quick fix, or use this signal to make real change. It's pretty hard to be both passionate and chronically bored at the same time. And commitment might be a key way to avoiding boredom. Our society really seems to value this more cool, aloof, kind of ironic stance, and perhaps views people that are passionate as being kind of quaint or naive or foolish. But certainly passion is something that we know is going to help us navigate through life. So as I've already said, boredom withers in the face of these bold, passionate ideas. So when I started preparing or thinking about what I wanted to say to you today, I thought, maybe at the end or somewhere near the end, I'd have a slide with, okay, lesson number 1, lesson number 2, this is what I've learned. And I thought, I don't know, maybe that's kind of boring, or, maybe that's not really going to help you think about your own personal situation. So I want you to just sort of think about what can your boredom tell you? How can you live your life in response to the fact that boredom is on the horizon or looking out for you? Okay, so enough about you and boredom. Let's talk about me again for a minute. So Master Leighton Brown asked that I say a bit more about me, and I think I hope throughout the talk I've told you a little bit about what I'm passionate about, how I do my research, why I've committed myself to studying boredom. It's only been about 11 years now that I've been studying boredom, but why have I been doing that for the last 11 years? So I want to reflect a little bit more explicitly right now about me and my research. Okay, here. So yes, I do get tired of the jokes, and no, I'm not related to this guy over here on the right. I know that the physical resemblance is striking, but so the cross I have to bear, I have to deal with kind of bad boredom jokes and bad jokes about my name and Clint Eastwood. So no, I'm not related to Clint Eastwood. So, who am I? Well, I'm a clinical psychologist and an associate professor of clinical psychology here at York. I coordinate the specialized honors program in our undergraduate program at York. And I've talked to some of you about the specialized honors program, some of you here now, and I'd be happy to speak to you about that again in the future, or any other of you. I'm very interested in our specialized honors program, and I think it's something I'm passionate about. I teach psychotherapy to doctoral students in our clinical psychology program, and that's also something that I'm very interested in and passionate about, is working with and supervising students that are learning about psychotherapy. I really identify pretty equally as a clinical psychologist and as a researcher, as an academic. My mind is kind of split in complicated ways along those two lines. And that's not always easy to kind of navigate those two realities, those two identities or two worlds. But it's certainly something that I try to do. And I think my research kind of reflects that a little bit too. You know, I tend to kind of straddle categories, and I think that's a wonderful thing. It's something that I find enriching. I think it brings a deeper level of richness sometimes to a research question. But you know, you need to know that it will cause challenges for you when you're doing research, because people don't know how to pigeonhole it or where to put it. It can be harder to find grant money. And if you're kind of trying to carve your own way, you know, it can be a bit of an uphill battle sometimes that way. So most broadly, my research examines how emotion and attention interact. And you know, as I've talked about today, I'm currently really focusing on boredom, in particular, how boredom and attention interact. I also am doing a little bit of research looking at how a client's emotional state changes moment by moment over the course of therapy. So we videotape therapy sessions and then code emotion in very small time intervals, like 15-second chunks, and look at how emotion is shifting over time, trying to use you know, various data analytic strategies to try to model what's actually happening in good and poor sessions of psychotherapy. I'm also involved in a knowledge mobilization project focusing on young adult mental health. So this is a CIHR and Canadian Mental Health initiative. It's kind of a multi-university, multi-site across Canada project. And what we're doing is trying to understand, what do young adults want and need to know about mental health? And then we've kind of gone to the literature to synthesize that, the answer to those questions, and create youth-friendly information and decision aids to help young adults that are struggling with mental health problems. Another part of that project that I'm really excited about is we've involved young adults right from the beginning of the project. So they're on the research team. They helped frame the research question. They helped, get the money and then run the study. And so youth engagement is another thing that interests me. I also have a private practice. I don't do much work in my private practice, but as I said earlier, I definitely identify as a clinical psychologist. I spend a day a week in my private practice. I'm not seeing clients that full day, but I'm working there. I do some supervision of more junior psychologists that are learning to become psychologists and registering with the College of Psychotherapists that work in our practice. What else can I say? Well, another thing, I really identify as being a father right now. So I'm the father of 2 children. I have a 6-year-old daughter and a 9-year-old boy. And that's a really big part of my identity. That's become a bigger part of my identity over the last little while. My research is kind of less centrally lodged in the center of my identity. That was an interesting process coming out of grad school, where that's your life, right? Your research and your career. And you talked about sabbatical, going away on sabbatical and spending time with my family, and then coming back, and so that's a challenge, but that's a big part of my identity. A little bit more about some boredom-inspired research thoughts. So after finishing graduate training and starting my academic appointment at York, I became bored with my research, I think, which is not a good time for boredom with tenure looming on the horizon. Somehow I managed to continue the momentum of my previous research and also establish some new research programs. And I'm very thankful that York kind of allowed me the space to create those new research projects. But starting a new line of research is not something I'd recommend for someone before tenure. It's rough. But I tried to judge new research ideas by what I came to call the Psych 101 test. That is, if I couldn't imagine the study being described or talked about in an introductory psychology textbook, maybe I wouldn't do it. That maybe it was kind of a little too esoteric or a little too far removed. So I've really tried to focus on research that had very manifestly obvious kind of ecological validity to it. And so, I think that's one reason why the topic of boredom really fascinated me. So first I'd say, in terms of research, find a topic, pick a topic that you don't find boring. Pick a topic that you really feel interested in and passionate about. Second, don't overlook the obvious or the common. You know, I think one of the reasons why boredom hasn't been studied as much by psychologists or academic psychologists is because it's so common and it's easy to overlook. We're just kind of swimming in it. But you know, but I think those obvious, common human experiences are really fertile and interesting places to kind of dig in as a researcher. Third thing I'll just say is, you know, you have to start somewhere and then figure out where the beginning is after you've started. So, you know, when we started the boredom research, we just kind of jumped in and started doing some stuff. And then eventually you figure out, oh, okay, we got to go back and we got to do this, we got to figure this out. You can't get it all figured out before you start. You just got to start and then figure out, you know, where you need to go next. I would also say that, at least I think this is true in psychology, I don't know how much I want to generalize it, but I believe it's really important to read really broadly, you know, like psychology is not that far, well, it depends on the kind of psychology you're doing. Some kinds of psychology are not that far from sociology, are not that far from theology, are not that far from philosophy, are not that far from, you know, a whole host of other kind of disciplines that you can learn a lot from. And I think that I really enjoyed, and I think our work was really enriched by looking at boredom from many different points of view. And I think also looking at, you know, if appropriate, qualitative and quantitative research methods as well can be very helpful, especially when you're kind of starting a new line of research. And with the boredom, you know, partly I was kind of bored with some of the work I was doing previously. Partly it was getting too hot to topic. People were looking at face perception and emotion and attention. And it kind of felt like, oh, this lab down there is doing that. I'm going to get scooped if I don't get this out. And so I just wanted my own sandbox to play in, right? Like, so okay, I'm going to play in this sandbox of boredom. I don't have to react to anyone else. I can just kind of say, well, I'm going to build this here. And then, so that was another kind of motivation for me. And I think if you look outside the psychology literature proper, you can get a lot of inspiration. And this might be a little bit more contentious, but I would say, you know, actually don't spend a lot of time reading what other people have said about your topic. And that might kind of seem crazy for me to say that, and I got to say it carefully because I got to be careful here. You have to be informed and you have to be able to link your work to past people's work. But I think that students often get hung up trying to master what everyone else has said about a topic. And I think that's a perfect recipe for kind of squelching creativity and innovation in your own ideas. If you really commit yourself to kind of trying to master what everyone else has done, at the end of the day, I think sometimes, unfortunately, the best you can do is kind of comment on what someone else has done or further it one little step further, or kind of, it becomes very hard then to extricate yourself from those systems and those ways of thinking that have been set up. So I would advise you to read a little bit to kind of get the lay of the land, figure out what you think, and then go back and see what other people say. And now there can be like a dialogue between you and your ideas and the literature. But if you just kind of completely immerse yourself, you're going to perhaps lose your own voice. Everyone might not agree with me on that, but there you go. There's an idea there. Okay, so I'm going to stop there. There's a lot more I could say. I'd be happy to talk about some take any questions or talk about some of our research in greater detail. Just want to highlight here all of the images in this talk came from the Noun project, which is a really cool project online where they're trying to create a database of icons to refer to words. You know, they call it the Noun project, but they have more than nouns. They have verbs there too. And I think that's a pretty cool project, and that's where I got these images from for this talk. All right, so I will stop there, and I'd be happy to take questions. Yep.
Can you talk a little bit more about how you get people bored in your experiments?
Yeah. So we combine 3 manipulations into one to kind of have like a super boredom manipulation. The first thing we do is we manipulate the perception of choice. So we know that if you have the same task and you give it to one person, but they feel they've freely chosen it. So you say to them, look, we've got 5 tasks here. Which one do you want? The red one, the blue one, the green. It can even be that simple. Oh, green? Okay, here you go, the green one. But they're all the same, right? And you give it to them. And the other group, you say, you're not going to have a choice. Unfortunately, you have to do the green task. You know, the other ones aren't available to you. So it's made salient to them they're not getting a choice. Then you ask them how boring is the task. Lack of choice, constraint is something I didn't talk a lot about here today, but constraint, lack of choice definitely contributes to the experience of boredom. So that's one thing we manipulate. The second thing we manipulate is the perception of the passage of time. So we tell people in the boring condition, you know, this task that you're going to have to do will take X minutes, but it actually takes longer than that. And then for the non-boredom group, it's flipped the opposite way, so that we tell them it will take, you know, X minutes, but it actually is X minus 5 or something. So the perception is, wow, holy smokes, like this is dragging forever. So how long? So they don't have their watches on, so they can't see. So the time manipulation is the second thing we do. Third thing we do is the content. So the one movie that we've used a lot is they have to watch a movie, an ESL, English as a second language movie, that's at a very basic level for people that are, you know, just learning English. And so for people that are English as their first language, they're proficient in English, it's like you want to like poke your eyes out, like, and the presentation is just really boring too. There's just like a talking head there, and blah, cat, see, right? And it's bad. And then we tell them that they have to answer content questions after, so they can't completely disengage from it, and you know. So we manipulate those three things combined. Other researchers have done different things, like just very, you know, mind-numbing kind of clerical tasks, like looking through a page and circling all the letter B's or something on a page. Yeah. Yep.
Can I ask 2 questions?
Yep.
Okay. The first one, I was wondering, in regards to incidence of boredom, whether there are any differences between the sexes. Because I kind of thought you mentioned that the boredom correlates with depression, and we know from clinical psych that depression, the incidence of depression is twice as likely in females post teenage years.
Right.
So I was just wondering if.
Yeah. So I also mentioned about boredom and risk-taking behavior, which might more stereotypically be associated with men, right? So yeah. So do you have any thoughts about that? What do you guys think? So what do we know about boredom and gender? Anyone want to hazard a guess? Well.
Yeah. Well, like I said, I know depression is twice as females are twice as likely to suffer from depression.
Yeah.
So I mean, based on that, I probably think that females are more likely to be bored.
Right.
But I mean, I don't know.
Yeah. No, it makes your line of thinking makes sense. I understand kind of your logic there, and that makes sense. We actually, it's unclear. It's unclear. And I'll tell you why it's unclear. I don't know if I can do this quickly. No, you know what? That's not going to work. Remember that the only graph I showed you, boredom proneness over different ages? There are 2 measures of boredom proneness in the literature. One is called the boredom proneness scale. It was developed in the 1980s by Farmer and Sundberg. The other is something called the boredom susceptibility scale, which is a subsection of Zuckerman's sensation-seeking construct. Some of you might be familiar with that. It's a subfactor, actually, of a sensation-seeking scale. These are the only 2 well-established, somewhat validated ways of measuring the tendency to be bored. I talked with you earlier about how there seems to be 2 different kinds of motivational systems that can be implicated in boredom. One is the high need for pleasure, sensation seeking. There's the high need for safety or security. One of the things, in fact, that our lab has shown is that researchers, until very recently, we would argue, have been treating the boredom susceptibility and the boredom proneness scale as pretty much equivalent, measuring the same thing. And one of the things that we've shown is they're not measuring the same thing at all. There's actually 2 very different ways to be prone to boredom. One is to be high on what's called the behavioral inhibition system, and the other is to be high on the behavioral activation system. The boredom proneness scale tracks behavioral inhibition. Boredom susceptibility tracks behavioral activation. So the answer you get about gender differences to some degree depends on which scale you use. So there's some evidence to suggest that if you measure boredom proneness using the boredom susceptibility scale, men are higher than women. And conversely, some research to suggest if you measure boredom proneness with the boredom proneness scale, then women, it's the converse. But even that is kind of, the differences are small and not very robust. And I think one of the things that we tried to really show in our lab is, hey, researchers, look, we got to be clear here. These aren't measuring the same things. And so I think it calls into question a lot of past research where people were comparing apples and oranges. They're trying to generalize across studies that used what we're arguing are very different measures. And until very recently, there has been no measure of the state of boredom. And one of the things that we did is develop a state boredom scale that we only just published. And in our data, using the state boredom scale, we find no gender differences. If you ask people how bored are you right now in this instance across a variety of situations, and we also found factor invariance across sex such that there's reason to believe that the scale psychometrically is working the same way for men and women. So I think you had 2 questions, but I don't know if someone else, do you want to, okay, go ahead with your second question, that's fine.
Okay. Second question was, I kind of went through the DSM at one point, and I didn't see a boredom spectrum disorder thing there. So it's not really considered like a clinical thing, but I know that you mentioned that there's a lot of social and economic costs, and even to the point that people kill themselves as a result. Based on your research, how do you feel that in the future maybe having like a boredom spectrum disorders, and you would have things like chronic boredom or episodic boredom or maybe atypical boredom, and and something that is needs to be dealt with at a clinical level.
So I have somewhat mixed feelings about that. My first response is I don't really want to pathologize what's a normal human experience, and boredom is a normal human experience. And I think to some degree, even though more protracted chronic boredom is fairly normative, I mean, certainly it crosses a line for some people and becomes much more debilitating. But I'm not kind of interested in adding yet another DSM category. I mean, I'm sure you guys are sensitive to those controversies, right? That as we've gone through various iterations of the DSM, the number of disorders, the number of pages has increased. I don't know what that means, right? But it means something about our definitions of boredom are socio-political constructions as much as they are biological facts. So on the one hand, I don't want to pathologize it. On the other hand, I do think people have somewhat like the trivializing of it, or the contempt or the disdain, or the kind of the lack of time for people that are struggling with boredom. I don't think that's particularly helpful. I understand those feelings, especially as a parent too. My son, right? He'll lie on the floor and look at me. I'm bored, and then kind of like, oh, what are you going to say? Like he knows I study boredom, right? So he's kind of poking me. He wants to see what I'm going to do. So I understand that kind of frustration with people that say they're bored, but I think that it's not helpful. Like we wouldn't do that with someone who had ADHD or depression. We wouldn't say, well, just pull yourself up by your own bootstraps. I think sometimes people need support and scaffolding to engage with the world. And so I want to take it seriously, but I don't want to add it in the DSM, I guess is my answer. Any other questions?
When you were presenting your definition of boredom, including I don't know what to do or what I want to do, it brought to mind an archetypical cartoon that I've seen probably half a dozen different cartoonists draw, which is a child, usually a boy, in a playroom filled with toys, who's saying to a parent, usually a mother, there's nothing to do. Now, your what to do if boredom strikes all seem to be first-person things. Are the same recommendations true in the third person? Namely, if you are the parent and your child is saying there's nothing to do, is reframing and getting curious and so on the same kind of responses to make, or is there any different suggestion in the third person?
So that's a good question, and I just want to repeat my cautionary comment that I already mentioned that we don't. I mean, I'm speculating here, right? I mean, people haven't done research on coping with boredom. I think there are some similar things and some different things you can do. I think first of all, the don't panic and get curious, right? Because I think often it's interesting. Like some parents actually, I think, are threatened by their children's boredom. I'm not a good enough parent. What's wrong with me? They need to be in more stimulating activities. And so it's actually like a personal slight to their parenthood. I think, So I guess I would say, you know, as the parent, you know, with hopefully more self-awareness and insight, to just kind of take a deep breath and just kind of try to take yourself out of the equation. I think there can be other kinds of personal reactions you can have besides taking it as a slight. But I think you got to realize, well, what's my reaction here? And then, you know, moving towards the child and kind of like empathizing or validating their feeling rather than just dismissing it. There's nothing worse than having a strong feeling and having someone say, no, 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 you don't feel that way, or you shouldn't feel that way, or there's no reason for it. That's just good. They're going to become more entrenched in their boredom because now it becomes a battle between you and the third person, right? So, you know, moving in, being curious, being empathic. I think the reframing can help. I think where there might be some differences is I use this language of scaffolding, right? So I think that adults or parents can help their child get into an activity and then pull back, right? And some kids can have a difficulty getting engaged. You know, I talked about my identity as a parent, right? My two kids are very different. My daughter can kind of get into imaginary play activity on her own very easily. My son struggles more with that. You know, but if I kind of sit down and work with him with the Lego or some activity and then kind of pull back, then he's kind of away to the races and he's fine. But if I just say, go and play Lego, there's lots to do, he's at a loss. It's like, it's not going to help him. Yeah. All right.
Okay, let me come now to a different microphone.
Okay.
Thank you, John. These faculty research profile talks are always unique because every one of us is unique. And I have been privileged to be at every single one of them. And I learn fascinating things about people as well as about what they do at every one. You were fascinating, not boring at all. In appreciation, I would like to give you this Calumet College bag filled with Calumet College stuff.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.